I never thought a simple mistake would change everything. The day I opened that door and saw my stepson like that, vulnerable, raw, and completely unguarded, I knew our lives would never be the same. What happened next spiraled out of control, leaving us entangled in a secret I'm not sure we can ever escape. We were a picture-perfect family, at least on the surface. When I married my husband, David, I didn't just gain a partner. I also became a stepmother to his son, Ethan. Ethan was 20 when I entered their lives, a thoughtful and introspective young man with his father's sharp jawline and reserved demeanor, but a warmth and kindness all his own. From the beginning, our relationship was amicable, though somewhat guarded. Ethan respected me, and I respected the space he needed to adjust to the new dynamics of our blended family. Over time, we found common ground, shared dinners, long conversations about his ambitions, and quiet moments of connection. He was at an age where he was still figuring himself out, balancing the expectations of adulthood with the uncertainty of his own path. David, on the other hand, was the steady rock of the household. A loving husband and a doting father, his career often kept him away from home. I didn't mind. It gave me a chance to bond with Ethan and cultivate a relationship that felt genuine, albeit slightly unorthodox. But even in those quiet moments, there was a certain tension I couldn't quite place. Ethan's silence often spoke louder than his words, and there was an undercurrent of unease that I chose to ignore. Our home was modest but warm, with laughter echoing in the hallways and the scent of home-cooked meals filling the air. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, there was a restlessness, a feeling that something was waiting to surface. I couldn't shake the sense that life as we knew it teetered on the edge of change, though I had no idea how drastic that change would be. Then came the day that shattered the delicate balance. It was just another quiet afternoon. David was away on one of his trips, and the house was unusually still. Ethan was in his room, the faint sound of music seeping through the walls. As I went about my chores, a strange feeling of unease crept over me. I couldn't have known it then, but the steps I took that day would lead us into a storm neither of us could have predicted. The cracks in the seemingly perfect life I had built began to show subtly, like whispers in the background of an otherwise quiet house. At first, it was nothing significant, just small things that felt out of place. Ethan, who was once so eager to share details about his day or his future plans, became more reserved. He would linger in his room longer than usual, emerging only for meals or brief exchanges. I tried to tell myself it was normal, a young man carving out his independence. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He began avoiding my gaze during conversations, his responses curt and distracted. I told myself he was just under stress. After all, he had recently started college and was juggling new responsibilities. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The incident that shifted everything occurred one Saturday afternoon. David was away on business, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I spent the morning cleaning, folding laundry, and trying to shake off a nagging feeling I couldn't explain. It was a calm day, but the stillness in the air felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I had just finished tidying up the living room when I noticed Ethan's door was slightly ajar. The soft hum of music filtered through, a faint rhythm that seemed almost melancholic. As I approached, intending to ask him if he wanted lunch, I hesitated. Something in the air felt heavy, charged with an emotion I couldn't name. I reached out to knock but froze when I heard the faint shuffle of movement inside. "Ethan!" I called softly, my voice carrying an unintended edge of uncertainty. There was no immediate reply, just a pause in the shuffling sound. My heart quickened, a strange unease prickling at the back of my neck. I stepped closer to the door, intending to reassure myself that everything was fine. But as I peeked through the small gap, what I saw froze me in place. Ethan was seated on the edge of his bed, his posture slouched, and his face an unreadable mix of concentration and vulnerability. His hands moved in a way that made my stomach twist, a deeply personal act that I should never have witnessed. Time seemed to slow as I stood there, unable to process what I was seeing. He looked up suddenly, our eyes meeting through the narrow crack in the door. His expression shifted from focused to startled, a mix of embarrassment and panic flooding his features. I stepped back instinctively, my cheeks burning as I tried to stammer an apology. "I didn't mean to," I began, but Ethan cut me off, his voice thick with embarrassment. "It's fine. Just, can you give me a minute?" I nodded quickly, retreating down the hallway with my heart racing and my thoughts a jumbled mess. I told myself it was an innocent mistake, the kind of awkward moment anyone could stumble into. But the image of Ethan's face, so vulnerable and unguarded, lingered in my mind. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Ethan avoided me more than ever, and I couldn't bring myself to confront him about what had happened. Every glance he cast my way felt loaded with unspoken tension, and I found myself reliving that moment far more than I wanted to admit. A part of me wanted to brush it off, to pretend it had never happened. But another part, the part that couldn't forget the look in his eyes, knew that something had shifted between us. What had once been a comfortable, if distant, dynamic now felt fragile and unsteady. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The days following that uncomfortable moment were a blur of awkward silences and stolen glances. Ethan and I both tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the air between us told a different story. Every shared moment carried an unspoken weight. Every accidental brush of hands or fleeting glance felt charged with something neither of us wanted to admit. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I found myself alone in the living room, absently flipping through a book I had no intention of reading. The words blurred on the page, my mind wandering back to that day. I told myself it was natural, just my brain trying to make sense of an awkward moment. But there was something deeper, something I didn't want to name. Ethan came downstairs suddenly, breaking my train of thought. He hesitated in the doorway, his posture tense, as if debating whether to speak. "Hey," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. "Hey," I replied, setting the book down and forcing a smile. "Everything okay?" He nodded but didn't move closer. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." I gestured to the couch. "Want to sit for a bit?" He hesitated again before stepping into the room and sinking into the armchair opposite me. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize, and stared at his hands. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about what happened." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "You don't have to explain, Ethan. It was an accident. Let's just move on." He looked up then, his gaze steady and intense. "It's not that simple," he said. "I mean, I can't stop thinking about it. Not just the moment, but how you reacted. You didn't freak out or yell. You were understanding." I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Well, it's not like it was your fault. We all have private moments." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But it's more than that. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like something's changed." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. His words echoed the thoughts I'd been trying to push away. "Ethan, we can't. This isn't something we should dwell on." "I know," he said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help it. I keep thinking about you, about us." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I stood abruptly, needing to break the tension. "Ethan, I think you're just confused. You've been under a lot of stress lately." He stood too, his height towering over mine. "It's not confusion," he said firmly. "I've felt this way for a while. I just didn't know how to say it." "Ethan," I began, but my voice faltered. The vulnerability in his eyes stopped me cold. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I know you're married to my dad, and I don't want to hurt anyone. But I can't pretend anymore." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, a mix of guilt, fear, and something I didn't want to admit. "Ethan, this isn't right. We can't do this." He took a step closer, his movements hesitant, as if afraid I would push him away. "I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know." For a moment, we stood in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end the conversation and go back to pretending nothing had changed. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself reaching out, my hand brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back as if burned. "This isn't happening," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. Ethan's expression softened, and he stepped back, giving me space. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "We'll forget about this," I said, more to myself than to him. "It's the only way." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The line between us had already blurred, and no amount of denial could erase the feelings simmering just below the surface. That night, I lay awake in bed, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Ethan's words replayed in my mind, his vulnerability and honesty cutting deeper than I cared to admit. I wanted to believe that we could go back to the way things were, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed, something I couldn't undo. And though I didn't want to admit it, a part of me didn't want to. The days that followed were a confusing blur, each moment filled with unspoken tension. Ethan and I avoided being alone together as much as possible, yet the times we did cross paths felt charged with an energy that neither of us could ignore. I threw myself into household chores and errands, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to our last conversation. But no matter how busy I kept myself, his words echoed in my mind. I can't pretend anymore. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. One evening, David was working late, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. The quiet was oppressive, the kind of silence that seemed to magnify every small sound. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean, trying to push away the restless energy building inside me. I could hear the faint hum of Ethan's music from his room upstairs, a constant reminder of his presence. I told myself to stay put, to let the night pass without incident. But as the minutes dragged on, my resolve weakened. I found myself standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the faint light spilling from under Ethan's door. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I knew I should walk away, but my feet seemed to move of their own accord. As I reached his door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the wood. The memory of our last conversation played vividly in my mind, his vulnerability, his honesty, and the way he had looked at me, as if I was the only person in the world who understood him. Swallowing hard, I knocked lightly. "Yeah." Ethan's voice came from the other side, muffled but steady. "It's me," I said softly, barely loud enough for him to hear. There was a pause, then the creak of the door as it opened slightly. Ethan stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound composed. He stepped back, opening the door wider to let me in. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the door clicking shut behind me. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made my skin prickle. Ethan gestured for me to sit on the edge of his bed, while he took the chair by his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "About how you feel." Ethan looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I shouldn't have said anything," he muttered. "I made things awkward, and I'm sorry." "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "You were honest, and I respect that. But Ethan, this is complicated. It's not something we can ignore, but it's also not something we can act on." He looked up then, his eyes searching mine. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't stop how I feel. And I don't think you can either." The words hit me like a punch to the gut because deep down, I knew he was right. No matter how much I tried to deny it, there was a part of me that felt the same pull, the same connection that defied logic or reason. My hands clenched in my lap as I struggled to find the right words. "Ethan, this isn't just about us," I said finally. "There are so many people who could get hurt. Your dad, especially." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I hate that I'm putting you in this position. But I also can't pretend like nothing's happening. You mean too much to me." I felt tears prick my eyes, a mix of guilt and longing swirling in my chest. "This can't happen," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "We have to stop this before it goes any further." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room as if he couldn't contain the emotions coursing through him. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice raw. "Every time I'm around you, I feel like I can finally be myself. Like I don't have to pretend." His confession broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I was standing too, closing the distance between us. "Ethan," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to pretend. Not with me." "But this," I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and hope. "I just need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel it too?" Time seemed to stand still as I stared into his eyes, the weight of his question pressing down on me. I wanted to say no, to tell him that he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself nodding, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment stretched on, the air between us electric. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Ethan leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, and for a moment the world seemed to disappear. It was wrong, so incredibly wrong, but in that instant it didn't matter. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened came crashing down. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. "Ethan, we can't," I began, but he cut me off. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. I needed to know." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "This has to stop," I said, my voice cracking. "We can't keep doing this." He nodded, his expression filled with regret. "I know. I'm sorry." Without another word, I turned and fled the room, my heart pounding as I made my way back to my own. The kiss lingered on my lips, a reminder of the line we had just crossed. I knew there was no going back now, no undoing what had been done. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The connection between Ethan and me was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. A ticking time bomb that could destroy everything we held dear. And yet, a small, selfish part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was worth the risk. The morning after the kiss was eerily quiet. The house, usually filled with the soft hum of life, seemed to hold its breath. I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me with a suffocating intensity. Ethan's door remained closed, and I couldn't decide if I was relieved or disappointed by his absence. I busied myself with mundane tasks, hoping the rhythm of normalcy would drown out the chaos in my mind. But every time I folded a towel or wiped down a surface, the memory of Ethan's lips on mine resurfaced, as vivid and undeniable as the sunlight streaming through the windows. I kept glancing toward the stairs, half expecting him to appear and force a confrontation I wasn't ready to face. David returned home that evening, his cheerful voice breaking through the tension that had gripped the house all day. He kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, and launched into stories about his trip. I smiled and nodded, forcing myself to respond when necessary, but my mind was miles away. Ethan finally emerged from his room during dinner, his demeanor calm but his eyes betraying the turmoil beneath. He greeted his father with a smile and engaged in the usual small talk, but he avoided looking at me. I couldn't decide if I was grateful or hurt by his distance. Every glance, every word felt like a minefield, and I navigated the evening with the precision of someone trying to avoid an explosion. After dinner, David retired to the living room to watch TV, leaving Ethan and me alone in the kitchen. The silence between us was heavy, each of us waiting for the other to speak. Finally, Ethan broke the tension. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything." I turned to face him, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. "Ethan, we can't, this has to stop. Whatever this is, it has to end." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know. I just don't know how." His honesty cut deeper than I expected, and for a moment, I felt my resolve waver. But I forced myself to stay firm. "We don't have a choice. This isn't just about us. Your dad, he doesn't deserve this." Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. "I know," he said quietly. "But I can't help how I feel." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "Ethan, this isn't fair to anyone. We have to find a way to move past this." He nodded again, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. "I'll try," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "For Dad. For you." That night, as I lay in bed beside David, the guilt became unbearable. He slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging just beneath the surface of our family. I watched him, the steady rise and fall of his chest a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I wanted to confess, to unburden myself of the secret that was threatening to consume me. But the words wouldn't come. How could I destroy the man who trusted me with everything? The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Ethan and I avoided being alone together as much as possible, and when we couldn't, our conversations were clipped and superficial. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every accidental brush of hands or fleeting glance felt like a spark threatening to ignite a fire. David began to notice the change, though he couldn't pinpoint its source. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Just tired," I said, the lie slipping from my lips with practiced ease. He frowned but didn't press the issue, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. I hated what I was becoming, deceptive, dishonest, and burdened by a secret I could never share. Ethan, too, seemed to be struggling. He grew more withdrawn, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. I caught him staring at me more than once, his eyes filled with emotions I couldn't bear to name. It was as though we were both trapped in a web of our own making, unable to escape, but too afraid to confront the truth. The breaking point came one afternoon when David announced he would be out of town for a few days on a work trip. The moment the words left his mouth, I felt the air in the room shift. Ethan and I exchanged a brief glance, the implications of his absence hanging unspoken between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts. I told myself I needed to keep my distance, to protect what little remained of the life we had built. But deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't sure I could. The days following David's departure felt like a test of my resolve. With him gone, the house felt larger and emptier, leaving Ethan and me to navigate a fragile truce. We avoided each other for the most part, exchanging only brief pleasantries when necessary. But the weight of what had happened, and what hadn't been said, hung in the air like a storm cloud. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't need washing. The rhythmic sound of water running and plates clinking offered a small measure of solace, a distraction from the thoughts swirling in my head. I didn't hear Ethan come in until he spoke. "Can we talk?" His voice was soft, hesitant, but it carried the weight of someone who had been holding back for too long. I turned to face him, drying my hands on a dish towel as I braced myself for the conversation I knew was inevitable. "Ethan, I don't think—" "Please," he interrupted, his eyes earnest and pleading. "Just hear me out." I sighed, leaning against the counter as I nodded. "Okay." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the words. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how I feel and how unfair it is to you, to Dad. I hate that I've put you in this position." I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish. I know we can't be anything more than what we are. And I hate that part of me doesn't want to let go, but I know I have to. You're my stepmom, and no matter how I feel, that's the reality." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Ethan, I'm not saying this to make you feel bad," he continued. "I just want you to know that I understand now. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And I need to be better, for you, for Dad, for myself." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan, you're not a bad person. You're young and feelings can be confusing. But you're doing the right thing. You're strong enough to let this go." He nodded, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "It's going to take time, but I'll try. I just want you to know how much you mean to me." I felt my chest tighten, the sincerity in his voice cutting through me like a blade. "You mean a lot to me too, Ethan," I said softly. "But we have to move forward. We owe it to ourselves. And to David." For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, we do." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us no longer heavy but comforting, like the calm after a storm. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that we could both heal and move on. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about Ethan's vulnerability, his honesty, and the connection we had shared. It was a bond forged in confusion and emotion, but it wasn't something we could sustain without causing irreparable harm. I realized then that love isn't always about acting on feelings. Sometimes it's about letting go, about doing what's right even when it hurts. Ethan and I had crossed a line, but we had also found a way back. It wouldn't erase the past, but it would give us a chance to build a better future. When David returned home, things felt different, lighter, more settled. Ethan was more present, engaging in conversations with his father and focusing on his studies. I, too, found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. The tension that had once threatened to consume us was slowly fading, replaced by a quiet understanding that some lines should never be crossed. As I watched Ethan joke with his father at the dinner table that night, I felt a pang of bittersweet relief. The connection we had shared would always be a part of our story, but it didn't define us. We were more than our mistakes, more than the fleeting emotions that had nearly undone us. In the end, we chose to protect the family we had, to honor the love and trust that had brought us together in the first place. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. And sometimes, enough is all you need to move forward. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? Could you let go, or would the emotions be too strong to ignore? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will challenge your heart and mind. Stay tuned, because the next one is even more shocking than this.